Hey, good morning. So this is gonna be a reading video. Um, this is an essay. Essay. I don't know if that's the right term for it. Paper. Um, by Eugene Gendlin on improvisation, and I actually it was a serendipitous, synchronistic kind of experience that put this paper on my radar, because as you may know, I'm a huge Eugene Gendlin fan, and I read a lot of his work. And it's always been clear to me through reading his stuff that things like focusing and a process model and thinking at the edge, they all have a lot to do with, or they point to, spontaneity and improvisation. But I had never seen him actually talk specifically, explicitly about those words or those themes. But my Twitter handle, and my Twitter name, Demonic, it's like part of the idea is that as you get progressively more and more capable of pure spontaneity, not impulsivity, but actual spontaneity, where you're really fully aware of the moment that you're living in, the context that you're in, your own capacities, and you're not limited by your own rigid sense of identity or, traumatic experiences which sort of limit your behavior range. When you're really free to act and are fully aware of the moment that you're in, that's when you can be truly spontaneous. And that's when, further, you're most capable of hearing that inner voice inside of you. You're most capable of hearing and sensing what is your felt sense and what is your body wanting to do and wanting to say. And that's, in many ways, at least how I'm defining one's daemon, is that voice that doesn't come from your head, but that comes from inside of you. That's like almost like this sounds super cheesy to say it this way, so apologies in advance, but like the universe speaking through you, because your body is sort of like the medium through which you interact with the larger world. And when you're truly sensitive and your body's able to, like, through every sense that it has, right? Through all your five senses, through proprioception, through interoception, through all these things, when you're able to really be in tune with what your body, all the information your body can take in, your body knows way better than you what is appropriate for the moment. So I've always gotten that sense from Eugene Gendlin's work, but again, I've never seen him talk explicitly about those themes. But then I was hanging out with a musician friend of mine, and he was talking about how he's really fascinated by improvisation and spontaneity in music. And he was like, hey, did you know that the Latin for improvisation actually comes from the word providere, which means to provide. And so improvisation basically means to be provided for. Improvisation provides. I was like, oh, that's really cool. And I'm always want to check and see if Gendlin has written things on topics that I find interesting. So I just quickly Googled Gendlin improv or Gendlin spontaneity, and then I found this, and it's like, oh shit, he's literally written a paper with that exact title. So how can I not explore that? So that's what I'm gonna do now. I don't know if I'm really ready to read this in terms of having enough of a background in his thinking for it all to make sense, but I think that's fine. I have read a lot of his work on focusing. I'm maybe like a fifth of the way through a process model. I've read focusing oriented therapy. I've read some of his other philosophical essays. I can't think of what was it, experiencing and the creation of meaning, or whatever it's called. So I've read a number of his pieces of work, but there's much more. It's not even half. There's much more that I haven't read. So again, I may not really be prepared to understand everything he talks about in here, but I want to try anyway. And maybe if I don't understand on this go, I'll at least discover what I don't understand, and I'll be able to read it again later, having plugged up some of those holes. So we'll see. And with that, I guess might as well begin. So, Improvisation Provides by Eugene Gendlin, University of Chicago. Again, for those of you who only know Eugene Gendlin as this guy who did focusing, he is first and foremost a philosopher. He was a professor of philosophy at University of Chicago, who then worked with Carl Rogers and developed these the psychological therapeutic techniques, but that isn't his primary work. Okay, so I'm gonna read as I've been reading other things on this channel. So I'll just read a paragraph in full and then dive into it. So, to improvise means to do without prevision. No form or preview is provided in advance. For example, one asks, how shall we proceed? The answer might be, we don't know. We will have to improvise. Improvise seems to be a second choice. The word makes it seem better to know, to have a plan. The word is formed as a negation, no already envisioned form. Improvise is one of many words that are defined negatively on the assumption that reality is or should be fixed in form. What's not fixed form is said to be ambiguous, undifferentiated, indistinct, contradictory, nothing. That's really interesting in this first clause when he says prevision, right? So breaking that word up like that. Seen in advance. It's to do, to act, without seeing in advance. Without seeing in advance what you intend to do, what the results will be, etc. He doesn't say specifically, but you could take that a number of different ways. No form or preview is provided in advance. And that definitely rings true. Like, if we say we will have to improvise, it's like, oh, I guess that's plan B, because you haven't come up with a plan. You haven't come up with a structure in advance to enact. You've not deliberated about how it should be done. And so now you have to fly by the seat of your pants and I guess it's okay, but not ideal. This sentence is kind of interesting. The word makes it seem better to know, to have a plan. I mean, I don't think he means literally the word improvise, but rather the meanings that we have come to attach to it. to improvise seems secondary, but there's nothing in the word etymologically that makes it lesser. The word is formed as a negation. I guess that's technically, is that right? The im, because then the providere would be the provide part. So to do without, I mean the im is, I guess, the without, and then without prevision. Oh, now I'm kind of curious. Prevision and provide, what's the connection? Are those like just variations on the same general root? To provide and to previse, right? Previse, well, revise, if you're writing and you revise, is to look again. And to provide in that, or to revise, is to look again. So to previse, although that's not a term that we ever use, would be to look in advance. But I don't know what the connection is to provide. Anyway, that's interesting. Yeah, and then there's this assumption that reality is or should be fixed in form. What's not form, or what's not fixed in form, is all these other things. And I was having a conversation the other day with another friend who was like a effectively professional poet, and they were talking about form and traditional form versus experimental form versus using form and sort of trying to jam your meaning into a form, as opposed to letting the form arise out of what you're trying to express. And I'm still in the midst of this conversation with them, so I don't know if I fully understand what they were trying to say, but my understanding of it was like that the ideal case is that the form arises as a consequence of what is being expressed. The form isn't decided in advance, right? The form for each piece of poetry, in that case, is a consequence of what that poem is. Like, it could be no other form. It's not like, oh, this is, this particular poetry form, and I'm just using that to express this idea right now. It's like, no, this form doesn't otherwise exist. It's a product of expressing this particular thing. So now I want to send this, I'm curious, I want to send this essay to them and see if it connects with what they were telling me about. But that's totally a thing, right? That we can get overly concerned with form and try to lead with form, right? And so whatever we're doing, whether we're writing stories, writing blog posts, writing poems, painting, whatever, it's easy to lead with form and say like, oh, okay, I want to express this idea, but I'm going to start with this basic story structure and then like shove my idea into that structure. And that's not to say there's anything wrong with that, but that is the direction you're going. That you have the structure first, and then you're trying to shape your ideas into the structure, rather than letting the structure arise from figuring out what actually is the best and most pure expression of the thing that you're trying to show and create. I think that's largely why I don't really write anything at the moment, is because I don't feel like I know what form is the best for the ideas that I want to share. And in the meantime, I kind of just let them take whatever shape they take as I let them just spill out of me on these improvised videos. I've thought about, like, I want to write, and I've thought about all these various types of forms of writing, and none of them really seem quite appropriate to what I'm wanting to express or how I'm wanting to express myself. And I don't want to just like jam these ideas that I have and I want to share into just some basic blog post format. So I haven't done that, and that's why there's not really any writing from me at the moment. Anyway, let's keep going. The usual theory explains everything in terms of already existing forms. Supposedly, we are able to understand something new only insofar as it is the same as what we have already experienced and know. It is a silly theory that would make novelty impossible. We could communicate to others only what they already know, which would make communication boring. If we really couldn't understand what is not the same as our past understandings, how could the past ones come to be in the first place? No, it's quite obvious. New experience must come first. Only then can later experience be explained by being the same as it. Since it had to come first in the past, it can still come first now, too. So this is reminding me a lot of stuff he's talked about in the process model. And in a really, really, really condensed way, I want to say the process model is an attempt, or maybe it's more than an attempt, it's successful, I'm not sure. The project is to lay out an alternative conceptual model of reality. The primary one, the one that we've mostly grown up in and live in, is that everything does come separate, individuated, atomic, right? Everything is a thing to begin with. We have atoms, and we have rocks, and we have trees, and we have people. Everything's separate. And then those things somehow connect to each other and relate to each other, and you like have to bump them up against each other somehow. And the alternative model, a process model, maybe we can call the other one an object model. The alternative is a process model where everything is in process to begin with. Nothing is cut off from anything else. Nothing is separate. If you wanted to get kind of like new agey about it, which he doesn't, you could say everything is one, everything is connected, right? And he does say that, but then he's like, let's be careful not to just fall into that way of talking, because that's very mushy. It's very mushy to just say like, oh yeah, everything is one, right? Because yeah, in a way it is, but in a lot of ways it's not at all, and let's be careful about how we talk about that. So I really appreciate Gendlin for that. He's like, look, yeah, there's something in that idea that everything is one, everything's connected, but it's not just that. And obviously things are also not just connected, because that's how we experience them too. That's how the world has been built into what it is, and let's not throw all that out the window. But anyway, so that's some background for this paragraph. So the usual theory explains everything in terms of already existing forms, right? So the object model, as I'm calling it, everything comes in existing forms, whether that means atoms or rocks or people or trees or whatever. Everything exists already as a form, distinct from other things. But I think then this is a continuation of the usual theory. Supposedly we are able to understand something new only insofar as it's the same as what's been experienced. But then this is him saying, no, actually that's silly. Because that makes new things impossible. If we can only understand things insofar as they are the same as what we already know, then we can't ever encounter or know anything new. And this is a question that he digs deeper in the process model. Is like, well, if we can never understand anything except by way of it being the same as what we already know, then how can anything new ever have happened? How can any new idea ever have come into play? Because if it couldn't now, then why could it ever in the past? But clearly new things have happened in the past, so new things can happen now. So a process model allows for novelty in a way that, at least in the way that he explains it, the object model doesn't really allow on a theoretical basis. Because a process model is more like, okay, well, everything is in process, everything is an interaction, right? Human beings themselves, he says, we're not just big bags of things, we're not just big bags of content. We are interactions. We're interactions within ourselves. Everything in us is interacting with everything in us. Our bodies are interacting with our environments, right? Breathing in the air, literally interacting with our environment, even at that level, right? In every other small way. What I hear, what I see. And then when we encounter other people, that is a new interaction. We're not just two separate entities bumping into each other. The interaction is new because my interaction as a whole process and all of the sub-processes that I contain is now interacting with you and your world of processes. And now there's a process that has never been before. That interaction has never occurred before until we encounter each other. And so novelty can arise from that. And also there's a lot here, or at least for me, I'm seeing him pointing to stuff about metaphor that he talks about in the process model too. But maybe he'll get to that. So new experience must come first. Only then can later experience be explained by seeing the same, or by being the same as it. Okay, next. Improvisation is obviously first. For example, in art, the composer surely improvises and only then writes down what should be kept as a score. As writers, we let a half-formed sense of what we want to say pour out immediately into words on the page. Then, in revising and sharpening that, something further and better appears, which we only now realize is more exactly what we wanted to say all along. And then we revise and sharpen that. Or as we revise and sharpen that, something more appears behind it and is really what we want to say. No one sits down, puts a piece of paper into the typewriter, and just types out the book Being in Time. No, it is improvisation that provides all fixed forms in the first place. Yeah, I can see people having a hard time accepting that, but I think what I can imagine that objection missing is just like a nuanced perception of like their own process of creation. Like maybe, you sit down and you have writer's block and you feel like utterly incapable of improvising and just speaking things randomly onto the page. But you're still like generating things, like your brain is coming up with things, you're shooting them down right away, but you're coming up with things, you're improvising them before you ever write anything, right? To get really technical, I mean, what he's talking about is like, no one sits down, puts a paper in the typewriter and just types out the book Being in Time, right? Like it doesn't exist in the sense of prevision. Like it doesn't simply exist fully formed and then you simply express it. Like there is some amount of time, some process through which you are exploring how that thing needs to be, exploring how those ideas fit together, how to say them. It's that part before the fixed form exists that is improvisation. It doesn't mean that the final form that it takes, right? The book itself isn't improvised necessarily. It's structured, it's revised, but the process of getting to that involves improvisation. So improvisation provides all fixed forms. I think that connects to what my friend was saying about in poetry, with like the form ideally being a product of what is trying to be expressed. Like obviously, yeah, you go back and you revise, and this person does that heavily with their work, but you start with improvisation. You start with not quite knowing what the form is going to be without trying to shove it into an existing form. So through improvisation, you're provided with that which you then revise and shape into its final form. This is definitely how I experience writing. I mean, that's what is going on here, right? I haven't planned out this video at all. I haven't read this piece in advance. I'm reading it and riffing off of it on the spot. And as I do that, in a sense, I'm improvising. Like, oh, what does he mean? Like, how do I understand it? How can I articulate what I understand? And as I do that, I'm getting more and more clear. And if I wanted to, after making this video, I could take the understanding that I've gotten to and the attempts to articulate that understanding that I've expressed throughout this video, and I could further work to shape that into a piece of writing. Maybe I'll do that, maybe I won't, but I could do that, right? This part is this sort of improvisational aspect of that process. And that's this part too, is like, as we improvise and we get a clearer sense of what we want to say, and we put it into the page, and then through sharpening that, we get an even clearer sense of what we want. And that's how focusing works. Like, I think I haven't explored the thinking at the edge stuff that he's done too much yet, but I imagine it works similarly. That you say a thing, you articulate something to the best of your abilities, And then as you do, you realize, oh, wait, no, that's not like quite what I'm trying to say. That doesn't quite get at it yet. Right? That's definitely how it works in focusing. It's like, oh, what is this murky, vague feeling in me? Oh, is it? It's like anxiety. That's close, but actually no. It's more like dread. It's like fear of catastrophe, right? And like each step in that process of being like, oh, it's this. Actually, no, that doesn't quite get it. And then you refine it and you're like, oh, no, it's this, right? And the same thing happens in writing and in making art. So that's how I'm understanding this paragraph. Okay. Elsewhere, I have dealt with the whole topic that opens here about reversing the usual order. I'm not going to click on those. About reversing the usual order that puts the fixed form first. For example, a metaphor comes before proper classifications and similarities. It creates those. It is not based on pre-existing similarities. That's a whole thing that I don't think I want to try to dive into. Like, his way of talking about metaphor is really fascinating, and he spends a lot of time on it in a process model. But basically that, can I even try to put it in a nutshell? Like, we can make a metaphor of anything. I can say X is like, or X is Y. And then I will start looking for all of the ways in which Y resembles X, right? But it doesn't have to in advance make sense. It doesn't have to technically work, right? I could say that my coffee cup is a computer, and I just made that one up, and now I'm like, okay, well, like, in what ways? And then I could spend a bunch of time being like, oh, well, it is a computer in this way, and it's a computer in this way based on my understanding of, what a computer is. And the more you understand one part of the metaphor, right, the more you understand X, and the more you understand Y, the more nuanced that comparison can be. And the more you can understand that it is a metaphor, right? But if you don't, like if I say, my coffee cup is a computer, and let's say I've never encountered a coffee cup. I don't really know what a coffee cup is, but I know computers really well. All I really know at that point then is you're saying, well, I guess a coffee cup is a computer. It's a statement of being. It's an equation. It's like, okay, well, I guess a coffee cup is a computer. I don't know enough about a coffee cup to say, like, it is only a computer in this way, in these very particular ways. It's like, okay, well, I guess it's a computer then. And that's where metaphors can really trip people up, is because if you don't really know what the thing is on the other side of the equation is, it's not really a metaphor anymore. It's just a statement about what this thing is. So when you like make metaphors about people, for example, you say like, this person is a piece of shit. Like a really blunt and basic one, right? If I don't really know that person, but I have all this meaning to what a piece of shit is, then I'm really just going to be like, okay, well, I guess that person's a piece of shit. And there's going to be no nuance to that. Like, they just are a piece of shit. It's not going to be like, well, I can see like their personality in some ways is shitty or like smells bad or whatever. Like, anyway, I said I wasn't going to dive into that, and then I did, so let's keep going. So, rather than arguing further against the priority of fixed form in general, I want to move in the other direction here, into the detail of the actual process of improvising, from the actual practice, or from the practice of improvisation. We can learn more about it, and also more about the general question. If not from pre-existing forms, how then do new forms come? What is this coming of improvisation? Cool. That sounds fun. What to talk about the practice of improvisation. Also, I should say that I have done a bunch of improvisation. I've been part of improv. Not as much as I want to, and I want to continue doing it way more. I'm also very curious, knowing that Eugene Gendlin was a professor at University of Chicago, and I know that Chicago is kind of like the heart of the improvisation world in the United States. Second City has its roots in Viola Spolin's work with like basically child laborers from back, 100 years ago, working with kids who had grown up working and didn't know how to play, and she was teaching them how to play again. And her son then took that work and sort of turned it into Second City and turned it into improv. I've not seen any evidence of this, but I wonder to what extent Gendlin was involved in or connected to or aware of the improv world in Chicago. I wouldn't put it past him to know and have been involved in that. So, I guess we are at the beginning of part 1 now. Okay. We cannot understand the coming of new forms just by negating fixed form. Contradiction, rupture, or nothingness cannot explain it. Improvisation is not achieved just by not having a script or score. For example, although I do not have a score in front of me, I find that I cannot improvise music. Terms that mean no more than not fixed form don't shed much light on how improvisation comes. Excuse me, I'm hiccuping. To study that, we enter a largely unexplored territory. How shall we enter it? There is no map. We will have to improvise. This is definitely a thing from other stuff that I've read about improvisation. For example, studies of improvisation music. There's very little writing about it because it's seen as lesser than composition, and it's seen as this mysterious thing that you can't, it's kind of in spirit, like you can't make a system of it because it is so full of novelty. So there's not a lot of writing on like how to do it, because the how to do it is never really it. You can try to describe it and there's plenty of books, obviously, on improvisation, like improvisational comedy. But doing improv is not at all the same as reading about how improv works. But yeah, so simply not having a forum does not mean that you are doing or can do improv. I'm curious about these words, contradiction and rupture. I'm not sure how those words, they don't immediately strike me as connected. Obviously nothing, yeah. Rupture, yeah, contradiction, like, I don't quite understand why those words are part of that sentence. I guess just by negating fixed form, contradiction is the negation of something against what is said. Rupture is like, I guess, like breaking something, breaking a thing. Maybe that's why. And this thing about how, like, this is unexplored territory and there's no map, so we'll have to improvise. It strikes me as very much how he talks about his whole work about thinking at the edge, which is about sort of using the focusing process to think philosophically and to think about theory and to think about concept and to explore unexplored territory at a philosophical level. So anyway, just reminds me that there's so much more Gendlin that I want to read. Okay. The advantage of making terms freshly is that we are less likely to fall into old assumptions. Old forms are implicit in all situations, but they do not control what comes. For example, although the old forms assume the priority of form, the new terms I will be led to make here will not instance the priority of form. If our terms come from improvisation, they will instance a world in which the coming of improvisation is always first. So he's using this word instance in a way that's not immediately obvious to me. But this thing of like making terms freshly, that goes directly with what I was talking about with focusing and thinking at the edge, is that you kind of end up, when you're doing focusing, for example, you end up like coming up with fresh as in new ways to describe your experience that you had never done before. Because if you come into therapy, you've come into a focusing session, and you just say the things that you've already thought, and say nothing new, then it's not going to work. Focusing works by slowing down, paying attention to that murky edge of your experience and trying to describe it and trying to clarify that thing which is so inarticulate. So if you don't find yourself coming up with fresh language in the focusing process, then you're really probably not going to get anywhere. So that's true there in focusing, but I think also true on a theoretical level when we're talking about concept. I'm also reminded of my conversation with my poet friend. She was, they were talking about the value of spending time with older poetry, older forms of poetry. And I'm just reminded of that here, like it's maybe the value of spending time with old forms is not that you are beholden to them, but that you can improvise from them, right? That's where you're starting from. And then the murky edge is like what's new just past the old form. Maybe you use the old form, but maybe you also realize like, oh wow, this thing that I'm trying to express right here like doesn't fit into the old form, but at least you know that. I'm reminded too of like, I went to St. John's College and we read all the great books, not all of them, but that's the program is great books. So we read all of these old pieces of philosophy, all these old books of science and math and literature, old forms, and so that largely shapes how I think about all sorts of things. I'm also very interested in like not just sticking to the old, but also my experience with the old informs the sort of creativity that I have and the new ideas that I have. They are inspired by the form of, fucking Aristotle and shit. Like, I don't know. I'm not really making myself clear, but anyway, yeah, like knowing form can help you experience or knowing the existing forms can help you discover new form, in the same way that like in focusing you have things that you know and things that you feel and have things that you are pretty clear about what you think and feel and have experienced, and then from there's a murky edge to that experience. You bring those to mind, right? Like you think about an experience that you have that you know pretty well and can describe pretty well, and in spending time with that thing that you know pretty well, a murky edge forms, something new, right? It like makes you feel in a certain new way, and you're like, oh, what is that feeling that's coming as I spend time thinking about this thing that I'm familiar with? What is that thing on the edge? And let me explore that. What is that? And I can see that happening too with art form, right? But if you don't spend any time with form, then you don't have anything to start with. Although, I mean, that's not entirely true, because he talked about earlier, like, as we write something, the process of writing something gives us something that then we can revise, and as we revise, we get more clarity about what it is we're trying to express and how it can be better expressed. So, anyway, there's like lots of ways to do this. Although the old forms assume the priority of form. So what I'm taking from that is when he's talking about like concepts that we already have, kind of have built into them this idea that form is number one, that form should exist first and foremost. And he's like, okay, well, from there, we're going to try to create new terms that don't imply that. And our terms will be developed through this improvisational process. So I'm not sure if he's saying like, so if our terms come from improvisation, they will instance a world in which the coming of improvisation is always first. So if we develop new concepts through this process, those concepts are going to have built into them this implication of a world in which improvisation is first, because that's how they came into being. Old forms are implicit in all situations, but they do not control what comes. I think that's partly too a good way of describing like that stuff, what my poetry friend was saying, or what I was saying about, reading old books, is that those, like the great books are, whatever you want to say, like, yeah, they're written by old white men, throw them out, but like, those have existed through the ages, right? Those were written thousands of years ago, some of them, and they have stuck around through history, and they have informed culture. They have informed and been in the inspiration for so much of the world that we live in. Aristotle has shaped so much of the world that we live in the West, in all these ways that you probably don't realize, right? And I barely even realize. The language that we use, how we think about certain things, happiness, for example, like in the United States, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You know where that comes from? The pursuit of happiness comes from Aristotle, and he has an entire book on what the fuck does that even mean. What does it mean to pursue happiness? What does it mean to be happy? I wrote my senior thesis on that question. It's not an easy question, and he doesn't provide an easy answer either. But that's built into like the foundations of the United States: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And everyone just kind of like, yeah, so we should all just like be able to be happy, right? It's complicated, but that goes back to Aristotle. So these forms and these ideas are implicit in all situations. They form our life. They're in the background of our life and how we experience the world. But they don't necessarily need to control what comes next. We can move from that, but they are there. And if we don't know that they're there, then it's gonna shape our ability to move forward. If improvisation is immediate and prior to formed forms, let us set that up as a new principle. Improvisation comes first. Let's begin with that and move out from it. Let us re-look at the world in terms of improvisation first. What shall we look at in this way? Certainly fresh thinking. What else? Writing too, as I already said. So this is interesting. Re-look, right? That's revise. Review. That's what review means. Re-look. Let us look back at our world and our experience through this new perspective that, maybe improvisation is always coming first. And we just haven't really seen that, or we've neglected to take seriously that aspect of experience. So in what way then, if we re-look at the experience of thinking, how might it be that, oh wait, there's like this improvisational process that precedes the form, or in writing, how is it that there's this improvisational process that precedes the final form of what we write? One sec, I'm just gonna grab something. Okay, so we're still recording. Yep. Also, if you notice this book here, Improvisation and Its Nature. Also, I have some books about singing from like Feldenkrais practitioners. And Feldenkrais, I won't say much about him, but he has a book, what's it called? The Potent Self, which is all about spontaneity and what is spontaneity. So there's a lot of little connections here to be made. All right. So, only fresh thinking and writing? Let us try out applying it more broadly still. Let us try saying that all language use comes as improvisation comes. First, we just try out saying so to see if it makes sense to say that. Yes, it does. When we speak, do not have I think there was a missing word there. When we speak, we do not have words prepared in advance. We open our mouths and the words come to us. If the wrong ones come, we can only pause, apologize, and wait for the right ones to come. An exception is when we only reread or recite words that we have prepared, words that came to us at an earlier time. So this probably isn't going to be immediately everyone's experience, because it's certainly not mine. Nowadays, I very much do speak like this. I don't pre-plan what I'm going to say in general. But it used to be, the reason why I got to this point was because I got so frustrated with only feeling like I could express things that I had prepared in advance. I had to go away and think in private and write down what I wanted to share, and then come and share what I had written out and figured out in advance, right? Even at a conversation level, conversation would be so halting because I didn't feel like I could say anything until I had thought about it and like worked out what I wanted to say, and then I could say it. But there was no ability, for all sorts of reasons, just be like, oh, well, I think maybe this, not quite that. Actually, it's this. I couldn't do that before. It was terrifying. And yet that is what happened in private. It was just more safe to do it in private, and then I would bring the results of that and express that, right? But nonetheless, that improvisational process was occurring at some point. And now, for me, it very much does work like this. I open my mouth and the words come to me. And if the wrong ones come, then I pause, apologize, and I wait for the right ones to come. That's how I make all of my videos. I click start recording, and then I'm like, okay, what's happening today? And then we figure it out. Language does not consist just of fixed forms. New phrases and sentences can come, ones that have never existed before. Usually, we use common phrases, but language is endlessly open for fresh formation, new phrasing, and new sentences. Unlike chess, Language is open so that no computer can provide all that can ever be said. I'm not gonna bother with the computer thing because I'm not a computer person. There's probably people who, work in AI and machine learning who could say more about whether that's true or not anymore, but yeah, there's more. I mean, that's one of the things that I love about hip hop, for example. I've never been that interested in poetry, but I really love hip hop. And something that can happen in hip hop that doesn't really happen so much in poetry, I think, is that because hip hop is spoken, you can play with language in a way that you can't play with it on the page, right? And you can play with the sound of words, and you can connect words together through the sound, and you can sort of reshape words to have a different sound so that they can connect to other words. Whereas if you wrote them down, it'd be like, yeah, well, that word doesn't rhyme with that word once you have it written down, but when you say it, it can rhyme, right? And so it allows new possibilities. It allows for new connections. It allows for new ideas because of that not being tied to the written form. A lot of times, the actual written lyrics of hip-hop kind of look kind of ridiculous because they're like, well, when you just read it like that, the rhymes don't really work as well because you don't know how the words are being expressed. You don't know the rhythm. You don't know the accent. You don't know the nuance in the way that he's pronouncing that word, right? The emphasis that he's putting on the word. So, anyway, that just as an example to say that language is open for fresh formation, right? Eminem has that famous video on YouTube. It's like, what are you talking about? Nothing rhymes with orange. I can think of a million things that rhyme with orange, right? But if you just wrote orange down on the page, it would be hard to find technically a lot of things that rhyme with orange. But if you are just playing with it as a spoken word, there's lots of things. So lots of room for fresh formation, new phrasing, new sentences, new connections, new phrases. But if you're only working with what the computer, what you can plug into the computer, right? If you're only working with the logical form of language, the written form of language, how the word is spelled technically, officially, then there's a lot less room. But even from there, you can play with it, right? Because then you can play around with the spelling and be like, oh, that word is kind of like this word, spelled differently, whatever. Like I was doing up at the beginning, provide, provise, revise, etc. That's not, I'm just playing, in that case, wondering about the etymology. But also, it speaks back to the old form. Knowing the etymology and knowing the old form and how the old form is built into and is implicit in these new forms that we have allows you to understand and carry those words further than you would otherwise. So, anyway. But a major difference between language and art emerges here. We speak by arranging always the same words. We do not fashion those sounds freshly. We use pre-existing words. Each word has its meaning already, but in using them, we re-mean them so that they mean not only the old meaning that they bring, but also what that meaning does and means here in this situation. New phrases come in which the old words can have new meaning, but the word sounds are not freshly created. I mean, it's kind of interesting given what I was just talking about, hip-hop and the freedom in that to play around with the sounds of words too. But yeah, when we're talking strictly about written language, we use words that already exist, but then we reuse them, we re-mean them, we put them in new context to mean things that they didn't necessarily mean before. And create new phrases with words that existed before, with old forms, and then give them new meaning. That's a fascinating thing in philosophy. A lot of philosophy is like that. You know, a lot of people like to poo-poo dense philosophical work. They're just like, oh, these people are just bad writers. But I think something that a lot of people don't realize is that in philosophical works, these guys are rebuilding concepts and coming up with new concepts. And you have to get clunky sometimes with language because you're using and you're taking old forms, you're taking old concepts and old words that meant something different before, and now you're bringing them into a new context and putting new meaning into them, and that can get clunky because you have to spell it out, especially if you're doing it all in writing. But that's kind of what it's like to read the process model. Is like it's a journey of experiencing him transform the meaning of certain words, right? It starts with, he talks about time and space, and he's like, through this work and through this exploration of like process, these terms are going to have new meaning, and I'm going to like make new concepts around those words, right? But so it's not just that he's like a bad writer and it's not simple enough. It's like it takes time to go from like time and space as we understand them going into the book to time and space as he's meaning them later in the book. Like, you have to follow along and go on that journey and understand step by step by step how that's happening. You know, so philosophy is not just a bunch of bad writers who are trying to sound smart. It really kind of pisses me off when people write off philosophy as being that. I think it misses the point of what's happening. But anyway, that's a little bit of a tangent and a rant. Okay, so in contrast, art does not use or remean fixed units. Some motifs might be used, but art is not the reuse of old motifs. Art involves a fresh formation of new sounds, images, rhythms, movements, and actions, exciting new sensations. We are surprised. We say, ah, or ah, whatever noise you say when you're surprised. Which, this makes sense. It would be really interesting again to share this with my poet friend or a musician friend, because I'm neither of those things, and see how true this is to their experience. But I mean, even within folksing, a lot of times I mean, in folksing, you start with the felt sense. You start with something that isn't preformed. There's no existing form, right? You're noticing something new, something complex and vague inside of you. And then oftentimes I like to start by trying to make a noise to express that. guess it can be very hard to go from felt sense to word. Like, that's a big jump. Sometimes an easier, smaller step is to be like, okay, well, what is the sound? Like, if I wanted to just like express how I feel through sound, what would that sound be, right? And like this last bit, he says, like, we're surprised. We say, like, we make sounds as a sort of function of how our bodies feel. Our experience is expressed in sound. Sound is also a somatic thing. And so you can make a sound and it's like a direct representation, or it's just like another form of how you feel in your body. And then once you have the sound, you're like, oh, well, how did it feel to make that sound? How did that sound? Did it sound like disgusted? Did it sound terrified? Did it sound sad? Was it a whimper? Right? And it's easier sometimes to then put words bit by bit to describe the sound, and then you can go from there. So I don't know, I do think that even in writing and even in the focusing process, we're not necessarily beholden to fixed existing units, but I definitely get the point with art, right? You're not, like, if you're painting, maybe poetry is an interesting medium, or like middle here, right? Because it is art, but it's also writing. And so you do get caught up in words and language as it exists. But if you're talking about just like painting, right, and you have a paintbrush and you have your paint, like, there's no, I mean, this is a very naive thing to say as a non-painter, but there's no like unit of art. There are, there's different brushstroke styles, I guess, right? But there's no like fixed, like, here's this word, and I can always say this word and it's always spelled this way for painting. I don't know if that exists. I mean, with music, it exists. Chords. Music is extremely precise. So I don't know. I mean, I think I get the general point that he's making here. I just wonder how much nuance actually is there that he hasn't really acknowledged yet. So, but what about performing a script or a score? That too is art, surely. Yet the sounds and visions are not new. Or are they? Certainly they are. So that performing a script, so it's something that's written in advance, right? In one way, it seems like that's not new. It's just being repeated. But also, it's not really. And before I read the paragraph that follows, I will say, like, during my time doing improv, I also got into acting and I started doing Meisner. And Meisner was really fascinating to do because it was my first time ever doing acting, and I always thought that acting was like about performance and like sort of faking, being fake, portraying something. But Meisner was about learning how to just express everything that you feel moment by moment, and then doing that within the context of a script, for example. So Meisner was developed for theater acting, when it's like you're going to be performing this script over and over and over again every single night. And so the words are the same, but you are never going to be the same. And if you feel like you have to feel the same and do it in exactly the same way every single night, that is just extremely taxing and impossible, really. So Meisner allows for you to always be experiencing the text and performing the text freshly based on how you feel that day in the moment, and it's not a problem, So anyway, I won't go down that rabbit hole, but I can see anyway how the performance of a script can be constantly fresh and constantly new. We don't go to see Hamlet just to have the play we have already heard and seen repeated. Rather, we hope that the play will livingly emerge. That will be quite new. Kreese calls a successful performance a phenomenon that appears. In acting a written script or in playing a score, it is the fresh formation which counts. Will this production of Hamlet be a phenomenon? We know Bruckner's Fourth Symphony, but will this performance of it be a brooding infinity or a sparkling Sundance, or just a pointless repetition of the score? It is disappointing when a technically perfect performance just runs on without bringing a unique new life to the score. I think that's pretty common. Like, I don't know how much I need to explain that, right? But like, different composers and different groups of musicians can play the same piece of music, and it can be an utterly different experience. And what is it? There's that one pianist, Glenn something, who's like insanely technically proficient, but a lot of people don't like him. I think Glenn Gould? I think that is. Yeah, Canadian. He's so technically proficient and so perfect that a lot of people feel like he is almost like robotic in some ways. Not everyone feels that way, but I've heard that about his renditions of the things that he performs. It's just like, it's just too exact. Like, there's nothing new, there's no new life in it, in a way. And whether that's true for him or not, like, it is a thing that happens, right? Different people can perform the same piece and do it in entirely different ways. And that's what we hope for when we experience a piece of art, especially if we're experiencing the performance of something that we know already, right? Like, we don't listen to the cover of a song just to hear the exact same song. We see that plays and scores are opportunities for fresh improvisation. When a score is provided, it is still the new improvisation that counts. I want to say something else about Meisner, because I didn't do it so much that I ever actually performed anything through that method, but I did get to the point with it that we started working with texts and scripts, and in Meisner, at least, you memorize the script in as rote a way as you possibly can, so that the words themselves are almost meaningless to you. You have no, right, like, it's not like you're trying to memorize, like, saying it in a particular emotional way. It's like, if this was the script right here, it's just like, we see that plays and scores are opportunities for fresh improvisation. Like you want to memorize it in like a robotic way, just so that the words are accessible to you. But then you get into the moment, you get into the scene or whatever, the acting context, and you're as present and spontaneous to that moment as you possibly can be. You respond to the moment, and you feel how you feel in the moment, and you feel how you feel in response to your acting partner, and you have those words memorized, and so then you speak those, but you speak them in this improvised way, which is like all of a sudden those words take on life in that moment. It's like, if you're scared, you're gonna say, we see that plays and then scores are opportunities for fresh improvisation in a different way than if you were like overjoyed, right? And so by memorizing it in that robotic way and then being available to the moment and how you feel in the moment and what's going on in the moment, you can express it in a completely fresh way. And that's how I understood Meisner to work, and what I found so fascinating and beautiful about it. Okay. That is also so in logic, or that is so also in logic, theory, and philosophy. Now that we have these methods and these texts, what will you do with them? We are not against well-developed theories, not at all. It is all the more exciting to follow a theory through steps of pure logic, and then, having gone so far into the topic, the excitement lies in then thinking freshly from there. Yeah. So that's, again, that like goes back to St. John's, like we take so seriously there that let's try to understand what this person is actually trying to say. Let's not just assume that we know, right? Let's really try to understand what's being said, and then from there maybe we can understand something new, and that can inspire us to think something new. But like, let's not just assume that we know what's being said the first time that we read it, because no way are we going to know, right? Even if we're having a conversation with each other, I don't always know what you mean right away. It behooves me to ask, like, oh, what did you mean by that? When you said that word, what did you mean exactly? Because I tend to understand that word in this way, but it seems like you're using it in a different way, so what do you mean? And then we can come to understand each other, and then together we can come to understand new things. That, in a way, is like a definition of philosophy, coming to understand what each of us means in our conversation together until we are on the same page and can think freshly together. So it bothers me sometimes when I see people reading philosophy, or even just in conversation with other people, and rather than hearing someone say something and being like, oh, what did you mean by that? Someone will hear someone and it's just like a word that they think they understand, and they're like, oh, actually you're wrong. And I'm like, do you even have any fucking idea what the person means? Like, how about you like ask what is meant, rather than just saying you're wrong and like fucking explaining the way in which that person's wrong, because you don't fucking know what they meant. Anyway, that makes me angry when that happens. I just want to see how far until part 2. I'm only going to read until the part 2. Okay. Similarly, a great score, many levels deep, gives the performer an opportunity for new improv. Similarly, a great score, many levels deep, gives the performer an opportunity for new improvisation there. But now we must go a step further. performing artists do certainly also prepare. They improvise at home or in rehearsals and ponder long about their phrasing, where to put emphasis, and so on. By the time they perform, that isn't the fresh formation. It is not improvisation. It is how they decided to play it. And that's interesting because just the other day I tweeted, I was like, deciding is to cut yourself off from. It's kind of to do the opposite of improvisation, rather than to open yourself up to new, fresh possibility. Is to say no to every possibility but one. Decidere, cut off. But yeah, and I think this reminds me too of the conversation I was having about poetry with my friend, that like improvisation for them is like worth doing as an exercise, but it shouldn't be the final form. And that's kind of what Gendlin's saying too, is like the actual performance, the actual piece of art, the actual book being in time, that itself is not improvised, right? That has been revised. It is how it is because it's been decided to be that way. The improvisation happens in advance to get to that point. I mean, some music is performed improvisationally, but not the kind that we're talking about here. The improvisation happens in advance. It happens in private. It happens at home. And it's done in order to arrive at a form that we want to stick with. The soloist practices this decided way to play it. The new creation becomes a repeatable spontaneity. There is a well-known danger that this prepared novelty will come out cut and dried, lifeless despite its novelty. Soloists know not to practice a piece many times on the day of a concert. The piece cannot freshly emerge, come from underneath upward, through the music, wholly alive, and then do that again. Therefore, just before the concert, one warms up, but one does not practice the piece. Interesting. Yeah, so you warm up and make sure that you are like limber and can do everything that you need to do, but are not like overtraining in the moment so that you just are repeating something when you go to perform. So you keep the aliveness there. I'm trying to think about, I would imagine like with public speaking too, or like even in like high stakes conversations, like a job interview, it does help, to practice answering various questions and like how do you want to answer certain things about your own story and how do you want to present yourself. But you also then, when you go into the conversation, you don't want to just be like robotically saying the things that you've practiced. So you want to practice it enough that you have a handle on it, but then you want to go into the conversation fresh and respond and be in the conversation and not just be like, oh, they asked me this question, now I must repeat the answer that I already prepared, right? Like, that's not going to do anyone any good. You want to be a real person. So, we see still another level of improvisation. The live coming from underneath is a separate variable, whether or not it creates a novel product just then. To be sure, new products and new ways of performing them do come from underneath, but then they can become repeatable and decided ways of performing. Then there is again the question, tonight, will it come from underneath? So within the performance of something that you've already decided upon, right? You've decided upon what the form is going to be. You can even perform it in such a way that allows for more novelty to arise from underneath and informs the performance, and again makes it fresh and new. And you have a choice about whether to perform in such a way or not, or to do it in the really rigid, strict, predetermined way, the deliberated way. So there are 3 levels of improvisation. When the new score comes from underneath, when the unique new life of how it is performed comes, and when what is already performed and decided nevertheless comes livingly from underneath. So we have arrived at a new concept, the coming from underneath. Right, so the coming from underneath is something that we hadn't really had specified before. And we had no real way to talk about it yet. Like when we have a form, I think I'm reading him right here. I could be wrong. When we have a form and we can perform, when we perform, what is the per meaning in perform? Perfect, whatever. So we perform it, we perform the form, we enact the decided upon form, but we can do that in such a way that still allows freshness to come up from underneath, right? I'm almost visualizing like a manhole cover on the street. And like if there's pressure and steam kind of coming out from underneath it and seeping out from under the edges, right? The form is like the lid, but there's life underneath. There's energy underneath the lid, and it's coming out from underneath. Okay. Before I go on, I need to point out how I have been proceeding. I have been fashioning new terms directly from ordinary situations. You might ask, what is this coming from underneath? We can say more about it, but so far, what did I mean by this phrase? I meant whatever that is which is lacking when a performance, though technically perfect, seems pointless, or when even a new way of performing fails to come alive this time. And I think he's had this a couple times, this like dash, and then he said there before, dash this time. I think he's just really trying to emphasize like in this particular moment, in this particular occasion, right? On this particular time that we perform it, it fails to come alive. Nothing comes from underneath. It's just the performance. It's just the decided upon form. There's no other aliveness. It's technically perfect and thus almost pointless, right? Why go see a technically perfect performance? It has nothing new there. So the coming from underneath is that which is lacking in a performance of that sort. There's nothing coming from underneath which makes it new. I have not defined coming from underneath. Rather, it means whatever that is which we know well in ordinary practice. I am illustrating a way to make new concepts directly from practice. So he's right. It's like that's kind of what we do in focusing too. It's like getting clearer and clearer about elements. This is also like phenomenology, and Eugene Gendlin exists within that tradition of being a phenomenologist, of like Merleau-Ponty as well. It's like examining our actual experience and attempting with better and better clarity to highlight actual parts of our actual experience, actual parts of our experience, and parts of our practice, right? That we haven't, and so a new concept in this case, I think what he means is like, we have made a new concept, we have this new term coming from underneath, which is just pointing at something that we never had a concept for before, that element of our actual experience that we never had a way to talk about before. And now we do. And so now it's a new concept that we can work with. Should it be called coming from underneath? Is this not a inadmissible spatial metaphor? We might seem to be caught in some scheme of layers imputed to the human person. But any other phrasing would seem to get caught in some scheme as well. Yeah, I mean, I think we're going to be using some kind of metaphor no matter what we do. We're using existing words, right? Existing language to form a new concept. And so those bits of language that we use are going to come with meanings. And then we're using them in a new context and reforming what the meaning of those words is. But they're going to come with meanings. And so and that's pretty much inescapable. I say seem to because although underneath brings a scheme, we are not in fact caught in it. New words exceed the old schemes they bring. They exceed the old schemes they bring. In my phrase, coming from underneath, the words are re-meant as they come into this situation. And so my words say what is lacking in a technically perfect but pointless performance. While from underneath is a concept, it is more than a concept. It is also what we know in practice in our situations. This reminds me too of it's a concept, but it's a concept which points us to actual experience. The details of our actual experience are not in the concept, but the concept allows us to pluck out that element of our own experience. I talked about this in a video I made yesterday where I was just reading my highlights from focusing-oriented therapy. And I had mentioned something from a process model too, where Gendlin sort of talks about let's be wary of theories that make our own experience impossible, right? When we have concepts and then whole complexes of concepts which get so abstract as to make the actual details of our lived experience seem inexplicable. There's something going on there. It's like, oh, well, I I do have a life, like I do experience my life, and if this theory makes none of that actual experience of my life explicable, maybe there's something missing there, right? Because that's something that we can fall into, is like, oh, well, like this aspect of my lived experience doesn't fit into the theory, so I just have to like ignore it, or like say it doesn't make sense, or just call it woo woo, right? And dismiss that actual element of my own experience, or just say like it's an illusion. But it's like, no, you actually experienced that. It's not just fake. Like Merleau-Ponty does this a lot in the phenomenology of perception, talking about these visual so-called illusions, right? And we can see this thing, right? There's like the famous one of a line with two arrows at the end of it. And depending on which way the arrows are pointing, right? If you have a line where then at the end of it, the arrows are pointing outward, and you compare that to a line where their arrows are pointing in. This is a terrible way of explaining it, so you might not understand what I'm getting at, but you can have the same technically length, the same line length in either situation, but visually it appears different. It appears that one is longer than the other, and you could just write that off and be like, well, theoretically, technically, if you measure it, they are the same, so you're just having a visual illusion, and you just write that off. Or you could be like, no, actually, like, that's my experience of it. My actual experience is that one of those lines appears longer than the other. And you could take that seriously and still allow that when you measure it, it's different, or it's not different, but you don't have to disregard your actual experience in favor of the theory, in favor of what the measurements tell you, right? Because we do that a lot. We so over rely on measurement that we just neglect our actual experience of anything. We call it an illusion. So, while from underneath is a concept, it is more than a concept. It is also what we know in practice in our situations, right? We've gotten this concept from looking in a very fine-grained way at our actual experience of practice. So yeah, it's abstracted, but we got to it by looking very explicitly at real concrete experience. If there were only determined meanings, forms, units, schemes, and otherwise only rupture, contradiction, disorder, we would be trapped in whatever is already formed, or we would be in limbo. There would be nothing from which we could create new art or new philosophical terms. Okay, so yeah, I think that makes sense of what he was saying earlier about rupture and contradiction. It's like if nothing new could exist, if we only had forms and ideas that already existed, and all we could ever do is break them or contradict them, then it's just a battle of like, is it this or is it this? Or I broke that thing, but now it's just broken and I'm in limbo. We couldn't go anywhere new. Nothing fresh could ever come, because we couldn't go further from what already exists. Right? And we didn't break or contradict anything so far, I don't think, in coming up with this from underneath concept. Like, we didn't have to contradict anything or say that anything is wrong. We just are like, oh, well, there's like even more nuance, right? If we explore the unexplored edges of our experience, we can see that there's also this bit that we've never even like had a name for before. And we clarified that, and now we've given it a name, and it's a concept now that we can work with, and that's new. It already was a part of our experience, but now it's a concept, and it's a new concept. I argue that in practice, we know and talk a great deal, or we know and talk about a great deal for which there are no concepts, nor proper phrases. Even very ordinary human situations are far more intricate than our common phrases can say. Yeah, I guess that's kind of what I was just trying to express. It's like, we're not like making up shit, right? We're talking just in detail about our actual experience. And there's so much in our actual experience that we've never had a name for, that we don't have a concept for. And in this case, we just made a concept, or Gendlin just created a concept for a particular aspect of our experience that we never really had a way to talk about well in the past, right? And that's partly what the process of phenomenology or philosophy is. It's like, okay, well now, yeah, maybe it's going to be clunky because we're going to start talking about the coming from underneath as a concept. But with that concept, we're pointing to a very specific thing in experience. And so while the writing might be clunky, it's very exact, actually. And there's a reason why it's very exact, because we're trying to point to something very particular. My phrase, coming from underneath, says something familiar to all who know about performances. Only my phrasing is new. But new phrases can also create something new. So that'll be interesting. I don't know if it's going to take diving deeper into this to express what he means specifically. But, I mean, now that we have a concept for it, we can look at it even more closely than we ever have before, right? We can almost look at that thing, that part of our experience, as an object, and then explore the murky edges of that thing, of that part of our experience. We can explore the edges of that, and maybe we can find an even more intricate concept around that coming from underneath. So it is a double improvisation I have been discussing. The one we are talking about, and the one involved in the new phrases that set up my new terms. Okay, so I'm going to stop here. But this has been really cool, and I'm glad that I'm finally reading this. And it's so fucking awesome to me that Eugene Gendlin has spent time really thinking about and exploring improvisation, because improvisation and spontaneity are probably like one of the most interesting topics for me in general in my life. So this is just like the best thing ever. So cool. Yeah, if you've watched this, that's pretty cool. If not, whatever. I'm just enjoying myself reading this. So again, if you're watching this, thank you, and I'll catch you next time. Have a great one.